The morning of the Duke of Ashvale's second wedding arrived with the particular cruelty of a bright English November, the kind of day that left no shadows to hide in and no gray sky to blame for the cold that settled in the chest. The church of St. Crispin's in the village of Kemsley had been dressed in white roses and holly, and the pews were filled with every family of consequence within 30 miles. Their carriages ranked along the churchyard wall like a display of the county's ambitions. They had come to see it done. They had come to see the Duke take a bride at last, because the alternative was that the Duke of Ashvale would go on as he had gone for 14 months, which was in the particular manner of a man conducting himself correctly through a life he had not chosen. She walked in from the side door, not as a guest, not as a relation. She came in through the vestry passage, the way the verger used his daily rounds, and she wore a traveling cloak still damp at the hem from the morning fog. Her gloves were mismatched, the right one belonging to a different pair, and her hair had been arranged with the care of someone who had spent a night in a coaching inn doing her best with limited resources. Her name, as those nearest the aisle would later tell it, came back to them in fragments, like the lines of a half-remembered hymn. Margaret Harlow. No. Margaret Ashvale. That was what she had been called once, before the world decided she was dead. The Duke of Ashvale saw her at exactly the moment his bride's father released his daughter's arm at the chancel step. His face, which had been composed with the kind of stillness that 8 months of grief and 1 year of deliberate intention can produce, went quite still in a different way. The guests nearest him would describe it later as a man who had looked up from a letter and found the letter's author standing in the room. The guests farther back saw only that he had stopped moving and that his hands, which had been clasped at the small of his back, dropped to his sides. Margaret Harlow did not look at the assembled company. She looked only at the man she had married 4 years ago in this very church. And she said, in a voice that carried because the room had fallen into the kind of silence that a room falls into when it understands something is wrong, "Richard, I need to speak with you." If you had been watching Miss Cecily Frome at that moment, you would have seen a young woman of considerable self-possession do something that demanded notice, which was nothing at all. She did not faint. She did not speak. She stood at the chancel step in her cream silk gown and her veil of Honiton lace, and she looked at the woman who had walked in through the vestry door, and understood, in the way that brides sometimes understand the private histories they are marrying into, that something had always been unresolved here. That the Duke's grief had always had a quality she could not quite account for. That the portrait in the East Wing gallery, the one turned to face the wall, had been turned by someone who could not bear to look at it, rather than someone who had closed an account and moved on. To the Duke of Ashvale's household, Margaret Harlow had been dead for 14 months. The carriage accident on the Calais road had been confirmed by 3 witnesses and a letter from the British consul. The body recovered from the Seine had been her height, her hair, her wedding ring transferred at some point during the chaos of a foreign accident. The Duke had mourned. He had mourned in the way of a man who does not know how to stop working, and so grieves only in the early hours, when the house was quiet and the fire had burned low, and no one could see him standing at the window of the library where she used to sit. That was what the household believed. That was what all of England believed. It was not entirely what had happened. There is a kind of woman who survives because she cannot afford to do otherwise. Margaret had been Miss Harlow of the smaller Harlows, the Lincolnshire branch without the fortune or the name, the branch that still had its books and its French and its modest education and very little else. She had been 22 when she married the Duke of Ashvale in a ceremony that surprised everyone, including herself. She had not expected to be chosen. She had expected to be useful, to teach languages to a neighbor's daughters, to grow old in a borrowed house on a diminishing allowance, to be exactly what the neighborhood had always assumed she would be. which was a sensible woman of moderate prospects, and no particular claim on anyone's attention. She had not expected Richard Devereux, the 5th Duke of Ashvale, to look at her across a dinner table and make his decision in the time it takes to pass the salt. 4 years of marriage. 4 years of learning the shape of a man who spoke in short sentences and meant more than he said, who left books open at pages he thought she had not yet reached, who stood very still in the doorway of whatever room she occupied before he announced himself, as though giving himself a moment he had not asked permission for. He was not an easy man to live with. He was not a man who knew how to say the plain thing directly, and there had been silences between them that stretched longer than was comfortable, and conversations that ended before they reached the thing both of them had been trying to say. She had loved him. She had loved him in the way one loves a landscape that one does not entirely understand, completely and with the knowledge that there are regions of it one has not yet mapped. She had loved him without quite knowing how to show it, which was perhaps the failure she returned to most often in her months of absence, and she had spent the 4 years practicing a restraint that had cost her more than she had told anyone. She had not died on the Calais road. She had been thrown clear of the carriage when the wheel caught on the ridge of the road and the horses shied, and she had struck her head on the verge and lain in the grass while the other passengers and the coachman were still sorting themselves from the wreckage, and she had been found by a farmer's wife named Clotilde, who had come down from her house at the sound of the accident, and who was a practical woman in the French manner, which is to say she had assessed the situation, determined that the lady was alive and feverish, and unlikely to survive being moved far, and had installed her in the spare room of her farmhouse outside the village of Ardres, without consulting anyone about whether this was the correct protocol. The British consul had arrived at the scene of the accident to find one dead woman who matched Margaret's approximate description and her wedding ring, which had slipped from her finger during the commotion and been found near the carriage wheel. He had filed his report. England had closed its account with her. By the time Margaret had recovered enough to sit up and speak in coherent sentences, it was 3 weeks later, and the November light was thin and cold through Clotilde's farmhouse window, and the British consul's report had already crossed the channel. She had written the letter to Richard at the farmhouse table. Once, twice, 3 times. Each letter said a version of the same thing. She was alive. She was coming home. She was not sure what she would find when she arrived. The 3rd letter came closest to the truth of it, which was that she did not know whether he would be glad, and that the not knowing was harder to endure than the fever had been. She had burned all 3 letters. She had been afraid of the answer. She had not come home for 14 months because she was afraid of the answer. She wanted to understand this about herself, and she was not entirely comfortable with it. But she had spent 14 months inside the farmhouse, and then inside a modest room at an inn near Calais, and then inside the question of whether the man she had married had missed her, or had mourned her, as one mourns a circumstance, and she had not been able to resolve it. The last conversation between them had been in the hallway of Ashvale Park on the morning of her departure. She had asked him, plainly, whether he was glad of their marriage, whether she was what he had wanted when he reached across that dinner table, whether the 4 years had been, for him, what they had been for her. He had looked at her with an expression she had not been able to read, and he had said that she was tired from the journey preparations, and he had left the room. She had stood in the hallway of Ashvale Park and felt the cold floor through her thin slippers and thought, "That is my answer." Then she had picked up her traveling bag and gone to the continent. And 3 days later, she had been lying in Clotilde's farmhouse listening to the rain. She had been 3 days from the Channel on her way home when she stopped at an inn outside Folkestone and saw, in a 3-week-old copy of the Morning Post, the announcement of the Duke of Ashvale's betrothal to Miss Cecily Frome of Frome Park in Derbyshire. She sat with the newspaper for a long time. The coffee she had ordered went cold. The fire in the inn's common room crackled with a cheerful indifference to the quality of the news being absorbed at the table by the window. She read the announcement twice. Then she paid for the coffee and the room, and she spent 2 weeks in a small house in Folkestone that she rented from a widow who asked no questions. And she thought about what one does when the life one has been making one's way back to has been quietly replaced by another life in one's absence. She thought about Miss Cecily Frome, whom she did not know and could not blame. She thought about the Duke, whom she knew rather well, and found she could not quite blame either. She thought about the portrait in the gallery, and whether it was still facing the room. She thought about the library window, where she used to sit in the mornings. She thought about whether she owed the truth to a man who had perhaps been making his peace with her absence. She thought about whether she owed it to herself. If you have sat with a question long enough, you arrive eventually at the knowledge that you cannot not act. This is what she arrived at in the small house in Folkestone on the morning of the 3rd week. She was alive. He deserved to know it. Whatever came after that was between them, and it would be difficult. But she had walked into difficult rooms before, and she could do it again. She hired a carriage and drove to Kemsley. The events of the following 3 days in Kemsley village were, to those who witnessed them, of the sort that recommend themselves to letter writers and diary keepers for the better part of a generation. The Reverend Alcott had understood within moments of the interruption that he was in the presence of a sacramental irregularity so significant that it would require consultation with the bishop before any further proceedings could take place, and he had said so in a voice of notable calm to the assembled pews. The Duke had gone into the vestry with the woman his household had buried 14 months ago. Miss Cecily Frome had been escorted from the church by her father with a composure that, as the senior Mrs. Cavendish noted in her letter to her sister that evening, exceeded what the occasion could reasonably have demanded of a young woman of 23. The assembled company had sat in the pews for approximately 6 minutes before the Reverend Alcott suggested, gently, that they might like to go home. The pews of St. Crispin's emptied slowly, the way pews empty when the occupants are not ready to stop watching but have been given no more to watch. The verger stood at the side door with an expression of deep professional uncertainty. 2 of the young women who had come with the express purpose of admiring Miss Frome's gown stood by the baptismal font and whispered to each other with their fans held at the precise angle that indicates information is being rapidly exchanged. The Reverend Alcott had gone to speak quietly with the church wardens. Outside, the November morning continued its bright, indifferent progress, and the horses at the churchyard wall waited with the patience of animals that have not been told anything has gone wrong. Miss Cecily Frome, in the vestibule, said something quiet to her father. Her father said something quiet back. His face had passed through its sequence of reactions, and arrived, unexpectedly, at a kind of relief, which he would not have been able to explain if asked, and did not attempt to explain. He had known, in the way that fathers know things they do not say aloud, that his daughter had been going to the altar with more resolution than joy. He had told himself that resolution was enough, that joy was a young woman's expectation, and that the Duke of Ashvale was a good man who would treat her well. He put his hand over his daughter's, and they walked out of St. Crispin's Church into the cold November morning together. And neither of them spoke of it until they were back at Frome Park and the fire was lit, and the first cup of tea had been drunk. And what Cecily Frome said then, to her father, was not a thing she said to anyone else. In the vestry, Margaret and Richard Devereux looked at each other across a distance of 4 feet and 14 months. "You are not dead?" he said. "No," she said. "I believed you were dead. I know. I read the consul's report. I read the post." She kept her hands still at her sides. It was the only way she knew to maintain composure in a room this small with this particular man in it. And the room was very small, a low-ceilinged space full of vestment cabinets, and the smell of old candle wax, and the particular cold of a stone room in November. I could not come home immediately. I was ill for several weeks, and then I found it difficult to know how to write. "Why?" he said. She looked at him. He was waiting, with his quality of absolute patience that she had never entirely known whether to trust. And his face was doing the thing it did in moments of significance, which was to become more still rather than less. "Because I did not know what I would find," she said. "Because the last thing you said to me in this country was not an answer. Because I asked you something and you left the room. And I spent 14 months deciding what that meant." The silence in the vestry lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "What did you decide it meant?" he said. "I decided," she said, "several things, at various points. Some of them were not very charitable to you." She paused. "I am telling you because I believe you should know the quality of what I walked through this morning. I came here not knowing whether you would be glad I was alive. I came because you deserved the truth, and because I am a poor liar, and an even poorer ghost." Something crossed his face. She had 4 years of practice reading his expressions, and she had never adequately catalogued this one. The particular shift when he was working through something that required more from him than he habitually offered. He turned slightly away from her, toward the small window that looked out onto the churchyard, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought about all the times she had watched that line and not understood what it was telling her. "Come inside the house," he said. "Properly inside, through the front door, not through a vestry passage." "There is a great deal to address," she said carefully, "before I come through any door of yours." "I know," he said. "There is the bishop's office and Miss Frome's father, and what the Morning Post will make of this before the week is out. There is the question of the marriage and the betrothal, and what the law intends." He was still looking at the window. "I am aware of the practical matters. I have been aware of them for approximately 8 minutes, and I find I am not inclined at this moment to discuss them. I am inclined to get you out of a wet cloak and into a room with a fire." "That," she said, "sounds rather like a command." "It is," he said. She thought about the command, and about the 4 years in which she had learned the difference between his commands that were deflection and his commands that were protection, and she went inside the house. Lady Dorothea Devereux, the Duke's mother, received the intelligence of her daughter-in-law's resurrection in her sitting room at Ashvale Park on the morning of the interrupted ceremony. She had not attended the wedding on account of a disagreement with the Duke's secretary about the order of the processional that had resolved itself in the secretary's favor, and left Lady Dorothea in a mood that she described as philosophical, and that the household knew as dangerous. The news arrived via the secretary himself, who delivered it in a voice suggesting he had spent the carriage ride rehearsing the sentence with something approaching despair. Lady Dorothea sat with it for a long moment. She set down her cup. She said, "I see." She said, "Where is she now?" And when she was told that Margaret was installed in the East Wing, in her former apartments, and that the Duke was closeted with his solicitor and 2 gentlemen from the bishop's office, she said, "Good," in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for a situation to resolve itself correctly. She had liked Margaret from the beginning. She had liked her because Margaret was the only person of her acquaintance who did not alter her opinions when Lady Dorothea entered the room, who had argued about the proper cultivation of a rose garden with both genuine knowledge and the willingness to be wrong, and who had once, at a card table in Bath, told the Countess of Weston something true that the Countess had very much not wished to hear, in a voice so pleasant and direct that the Countess had not realized, until she was in her carriage going home, that she had been told a thing she needed to know. She had also never said this to anyone. But the 14 months since the consul's report had been the longest months Ashvale Park had known in recent memory, and not only because her son had been unhappy. It was something subtler than that. The house had lost a quality she did not have a name for. Something to do with the way it had been occupied when Margaret was in it, the particular attentiveness the rooms had seemed to have when there was someone in them who had decided to be fully present rather than merely to reside. She went to the east wing at 4 in the afternoon. She found Margaret sitting at the window in her traveling clothes, a cup of tea going cold beside her. Margaret's hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who has been holding herself together by an act of concentrated will for several hours. "You look terrible," Lady Dorothea said. "I have been better," Margaret agreed. Lady Dorothea sat in the opposite chair and looked at her with the full attention she brought to things she intended to understand. Margaret did not look away. That was always the thing about her. "He was not glad," Margaret said. She said it as a statement, which was how she delivered things she was frightened of saying. "When I left for the continent, I asked him and he would not answer. And I have spent 14 months with that silence." "What have you made of it?" Lady Dorothea said. "I have made of it," Margaret said slowly, "that it might mean he could not say the thing out loud, or that it might mean there was nothing to say." She looked at her cold tea. "I cannot tell you which answer I arrived at more often. I can tell you that I came home anyway, because the alternative was to remain a ghost at the cost of his knowing the truth. And that seemed to me a worse thing than whatever I would find." Lady Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "My son," she said, "is a man who does not act for convenience, or for dynasty, or for the season's expectations. He could have married any number of young women before you. He did not find any of them worth the question of whether they were glad of him." She paused. "He asked you. Across a dinner table, within 4 days of making your acquaintance, in front of a room full of people who thought he was incapable of such a thing. I remember the evening precisely. I remember his face when you argued with him about Cowper's letters and refused to concede his point. He looked," she said, "like a man who had found something he had given up expecting to find." Margaret was quiet. "What he cannot do," Lady Dorothea continued, "which is his father's failing and his grandfather's, is say the simple plain thing when the person who needs to hear it is standing directly in front of him. He is better with actions than with declarations. It is either a virtue or an exasperating limitation, depending on the moment." "He has not come to speak with me," Margaret said. "He has been occupied with the bishop's office," Lady Dorothea said. "He is untangling a considerable legal complication that is the direct result of your being alive, which is to say, he is working very hard on your behalf, after a morning that was, for him, I suspect, rather a great deal." She rose and adjusted her shawl and moved toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, which was not her customary habit. "He turned your portrait," she said, without looking back. "In the gallery, within a fortnight of the funeral. He turned it to face the wall and told the household not to touch it. And when I asked him why, he said only that he preferred not to see it at present." She paused. "I have had 14 months to consider what that means. I believe I know." She left. Margaret sat in the thin afternoon light and thought about the portrait. She thought about the specific action of turning a portrait to face the wall, which was not the action of closing an account. A closed account is filed, archived, placed somewhere that does not require daily proximity. A portrait turned to face the wall is a thing still present, still in the room, still in the house, which one has decided one cannot look at directly, but cannot bring oneself to remove. She had lived with Richard Devereux long enough to know that he did not perform grief for an audience. There had been no audience in the gallery, only a household he had instructed not to touch the thing, and the thin comfort of a wall between himself and an image he had not been able to part with. She had sat in Clotilde's farmhouse and told herself the silence in the hallway had meant one thing. She had burned 3 letters and sat in an inn outside Folkestone and told herself it had meant another. She had spent 14 months with the question of it, turning it in her hands the way one turns a letter whose seal one is not yet sure whether to break. She thought that perhaps she had been asking the wrong question. She had been asking whether he was glad she was alive, and the portrait in the gallery had been answering, for 14 months, a slightly different one. She allowed herself, for the first time since she had walked into the church that morning, to feel something that was not simply resolution. He came at 6. He came without the secretary, and without the bishop's letters, and without the careful presentation of practical matters that she had half expected from him. He came in through the door without knocking, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at her in the way that a man looks at something he has been told he would never see again, and there was nothing composed about it. "The marriage is intact," he said. "The bishop's office has confirmed it. No death, no dissolution, no grounds for annulment. The betrothal to Miss Frome is voided, and her father has been compensated, generously, and I believe he is not displeased, as Miss Frome had 2 other offers this season, and her father is a practical man." He stopped. "I am telling you the practical matters first, because I am better at the practical matters. I want you to know that I am telling you the practical matters first, because I cannot begin with the other thing without them, and not because I consider the practical matters more important than the other thing." "What is the other thing?" she said. He looked at her. She was sitting at the window in the last of the evening light, with her wet cloak finally hung on the back of the door, and a fresh cup of tea she had not drunk either, and her hands in her lap, and her face doing what it had always done in the most charged moments between them, which was to become entirely and devastatingly honest. He crossed the room. He did it as he did most things, without announcement, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the particular line between his brows that appeared when he was working very hard at something. "I did not answer your question," he said. "In the hallway, before the continent, you asked me something I had been waiting for you to ask for 4 years, and I looked at you, and I could not find the words for it, and so I said the wrong thing and left the room. And then you left the country. And then I was told you were dead." He paused. "The question became one of the things I spent 14 months being unable to resolve. What I would have said. Whether you knew it anyway. Whether the 4 years had communicated it, or whether I had been so thoroughly inadequate in the ordinary language of it that you had gone to your death not knowing." She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her voice level. "What would you have said?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "That you are the first person," he said, "who ever argued with me across a dinner table and refused to stop when I failed to agree. That I had lived in this house for 34 years, and it had felt, for most of them, like a house, and that within 2 months of your arrival, it felt like something else. That I left books open at the pages I thought you had not reached, because the alternative was to give you the book outright, which seemed too direct. which I understood at the time was an absurdity in a man who had asked you to marry him after 4 days. He paused. That I stood in the doorway of whatever room you were in because I wanted a moment to look at you before you knew I was there. That when you were not here, the house went back to being a house, and I was not able to account for the difference. Margaret's hands were not entirely still in her lap. I was afraid, she said. In the farmhouse. In the inn at Folkestone. I read the announcement of the betrothal, and I sat with a cold cup of coffee. And I thought about what it meant that you had mourned me, and then continued. And I thought that perhaps it meant the mourning had been what mourning ought to be, a proper observance, and that you had done it correctly and moved forward. And I thought that perhaps that was right. That perhaps that was what I ought to want for you. It was not what I wanted for myself, he said. No, she said. I can see that now. She looked up at him. I burned 3 letters. In Clotilda's farmhouse. All of them said the same version. She was alive. She was coming home. She did not know whether he would be glad. She paused. I should not have burned them. No, he said. You should not have. I should have come home the moment I was able to stand. Yes, he said. I was afraid, she said again. She said it plainly, without apology or self-justification, because she was a woman who had made a considerable mistake, and understood that the correct response to a mistake was to name it clearly. I was afraid that if I came home and found that you had not missed me, I would not be able to bear it. I had spent 4 years not asking you directly. I asked you once, in the hallway, and you left the room, and I concluded that I was better off not knowing than knowing something I could not undo. And then I was dead, as far as England was concerned. And it seemed to me that a woman who is dead can stay that way if she chooses, and no one is harmed by it. I was harmed by it, he said. He said it quietly. He said it in the voice he used for things that cost him something. I know, she said. I am sorry. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he sat down in the chair beside her, which was not the chair he usually sat in when they had spent evenings in this room together, but a closer one, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he had more to say and was choosing the order of it. I turned your portrait, he said, because I could not look at it. That was not the action of a man who had properly mourned and moved forward. I am aware it was not. Your mother told me, she said. My mother, he said, is a woman of exceptional perception and a complete absence of restraint about sharing what she perceives. He paused, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard before, something almost careful, as though he were attending to a thing he did not want to mishandle. She is also correct. Margaret looked at her hands for a moment. She was cold, still, and tired from the coaching in and the fog and the church and the 6 hours of sitting in this room not knowing what would happen next. She was also, she realized, no longer afraid. The fear had been the engine of 14 months, and it had brought her to this room, and now it had stopped, because the thing she had been afraid of had turned out to be a different thing than she had believed. He put his hand over hers. It was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet one, the way he reached for the things he intended to keep, without announcement. She turned her hand under his. Outside the window of the East Wing sitting room, the November rain that had been threatening since morning began at last, thin and steady on the grounds of Ashvale Park, on the rose garden where she had argued with the head groundskeeper about drainage, on the church where she had married this man 4 years ago and returned to this morning through a vestry door with a wet hem and her heart in her mouth. He said her name. He said Margaret, not your Grace, not Mrs. Devereux. Margaret. The way he had said it only in the most private moments of 4 years. The way she had always understood was a thing he offered without quite knowing he was offering it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They sat in the last of the firelight while the rain fell on Ashvale Park, and the November evening settled around them. And it was a long time before either of them spoke again. And what they said when they spoke was the ordinary practical language of a marriage resuming itself, which was its own kind of gift. The ceremony that made it officially current, as opposed to the ceremony that had always been legally unbroken and needed only a bishop's letter to confirm it, was a small affair in the first week of December. The Reverend Alcott came to the house and read the necessary words in the morning room with Lady Dorothea present, and the secretary, and the housekeeper, and a small girl of 7, who was the daughter of the head groundskeeper, and who had wandered in through the garden door and refused politely, but firmly, to be removed. It was a brief ceremony with no witnesses from the county and no pews full of the neighborhood's ambitions, and Margaret thought it was the finest ceremony she had attended. The dismissive label that had followed her through Kemsley's drawing rooms had been voiced, in its 3 occasions, by people who had considered themselves accurate. The first had been Lady Wotton, in a murmured exchange at the assembly rooms in the first year of the marriage. "Only a Harlow, whatever the title," she had said. The second had been Mrs. Grenville, the rector's wife, at a summer picnic. "Always only a Harlow." The third had been Sir Clement Cavendish himself, at the interrupted wedding, in a voice intended for his neighbor alone. "Only a Harlow, and a dead one at that," he had said. Sir Clement had spent the remainder of November reconsidering this statement, in part because his neighbor's response had been a very long look, and in part because the story as it settled into its permanent form in the neighborhood's collective understanding was not a story that reflected well on those who had described the Duchess of Ashvale as a Harlow who could be dispensed with. She was a Harlow. That part had never been wrong. She had no quarrel with it. The Harlows of Lincolnshire were not a grand family, but they were a family that had taught their daughters French and music and the habit of forming their own opinions, and Margaret had made use of all 3 in the 4 years she had spent as the Duchess of Ashvale, and the 14 months she had spent as no one in particular in a farmhouse outside Ardres. What she was additionally, and what the neighborhood had only slowly come to understand, was the person who had walked into a church on a November morning with a wet hem and no certainty about what she would find, and had done it anyway, because she was alive, and the man she loved deserved to know it. The portrait in the gallery was turned back to face the room before the end of that first week. Margaret stood before it one morning in January, her coffee warm in her hands, and studied the woman in it, with the slight critical distance of someone examining a likeness painted 3 years ago that has not quite kept pace with the original. She went to find Richard in the library, where he was at his papers, and she told him that she thought the portrait was not very like her, and that they ought to commission another. He looked up from his work. He looked at her with the quality of attention that she had spent 4 years learning to receive without looking away from, the attention that meant she was the only thing in the room he was interested in. "Come here," he said. She crossed the library. He took her hand, not in the manner of a man holding something fragile, but in the manner of a man who does not intend to let go. And she stood at his side in the winter morning light, and felt the particular quality of a house that has something in it, that it was missing, and did not say anything, and did not need to. The new portrait was commissioned the following autumn and installed in the gallery before Christmas. Lady Dorothea pronounced it an excellent likeness. It showed Margaret at the window of the morning room, turned slightly toward the light, her hands in her lap and her expression composed but not closed, the expression of a woman who has decided to be present in the room she is in and intends to remain so. The small daughter of the head groundskeeper, who had made herself at home in Ashvale Park in the way that children sometimes do when they understand they are welcome, stood in front of the portrait one afternoon and studied it with serious brown eyes. "She looks like she is listening for something," she said. "What do you think she's listening for?" Margaret asked. She asked it because she considered the child's opinion worth having, which was a thing she considered about most people who had not yet been taught to prevaricate. The child thought about it with the gravity the question deserved. "I think she is listening for the door," she said. "Like she wants to hear when someone comes in." She was not wrong. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the grounds of Ashvale Park, settling soft and silent on the rose garden and the gravel drive and the roof of the church of St. Crispin's in the village of Kemsley, on all the stones and all the grounds of a house that had, after 14 months of holding its breath, learned at last how to exhale. Margaret stood at the gallery window and watched the snow fall, and thought about the farmhouse, and the burned letters, and the coaching inn outside Folkestone, and the cold cup of coffee, and the Morning Post. All of it at a useful distance now, the kind of distance that does not diminish, but clarifies. She heard the library door open along the corridor. She turned from the window. If this is the sort of story that has moved you, leave a word below, because Margaret Harlowe's journey home is the kind of story that wants to be kept. The snow fell. The fire in the gallery grate burned warm and steady. Richard Devereux came through the door in the manner of a man who had spent considerable time in his own house, taking the long way around to the room where his wife was, and she was there when he arrived, as she intended to be, as she had been for 4 years, and would be for all the years that remained, which were, by any reckoning that mattered, a great many.